This is chapter 24 on the origin of species, which means how do we get diversity? How do we get all of the vast amount of species that we have today? We know about natural selection. I apologize, I have a chocolate in my mouth. Speciation is defined as a process by which one species splits into two or more species. So species A splits, and you have species B and C now, which are not the same, and they don't breed together anymore. And that's going to be important later. Speciation explains the differences between species, but it also shows and highlights the similarities between them. Remember that there are a lot of things that are common among all living things. We share genes in common with yeast, bacteria, plants, and ultimately we share the genetic code, A, T, G, and C. All living things are made out of this genetic code. There are no more bases, no less bases. When one species splits into two, the species that result share many characteristics because they're descended from the same common ancestral species. A then would be your ancestral species in the example I was just giving above. Do you recall the difference from our last notes between microevolution and macroevolution? I hope that you said microevolution is something that we can observe in our lifetime, and it's based on allele frequency change over a period of time, and that macroevolution is indicating that a common ancestor unites all life. Speciation is the bridge between these two. How do we go from microevolution, where species are simply changing, to creating whole new species where we can unite them all with common ancestors? So speciation is the bridge that keeps these together. Biological species concept, before we talk too much about speciation, we have to really define what a species is. But it's really difficult to define when two populations are actually considered species. Sometimes when you look at them, they look very similar, and so you think they are the same species. But scientists have different ways of defining what we consider separate species. And the one that biologists use is called the biological species concept. This concept goes on the basis that a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature and produce viable, fertile offspring. These two are important. If the two populations can breed together, their offspring are fertile and viable and healthy, then we say yes, those two are still the same species. When they become so different that they no longer breed together, or their offspring are not healthy and fertile, then we start to think that maybe they are separate species. The absence of gene flow plays a key role in the formation of new species, as well as keeping them apart once their potential to interbreed has been reduced. Reproductive isolation is the existence of biological factors or barriers that impede members of two species from interbreeding and producing viable fertile offspring. Although a single barrier may not prevent gene flow, a combination of several barriers can effectively isolate the species gene pool. So the idea here is that the gene pools are separate. They're no longer breeding together, so they are no longer mixing their genes with the other group. There is an absence of gene flow. Hybrids are offspring that result from an interspecific mating. So these are organisms that are technically not the same species, but they are still breeding together. For example, we know that sometimes dogs and wolves mate. We also know that horses and donkeys can mate. They produce mules. Okay, these are situations where we are creating some kind of a hybrid. So what barriers can prevent mating? There are some that happen before the mating ever occurs or before the zygote is formed. There are some that are after the zygote is formed. So it allows mating, allows fertilization, but something after that produces the inability to develop a viable fertile offspring. So these pages are on the next couple of slides. So here's kind of the separation between pre-zygotic and post-zygotic. Remember, a zygote is a fertilized egg. So all the way over here, what can happen is these things will prevent mating in general. For example, if they're isolated in their habitat, land versus water, they're not going to make it contact with each other. Temporal might have something to do with when they come out, maybe at night or day, something like that. They're not going to come in contact with each other. And behavioral isolation, I kind of talked about this a little bit with the beaks and finches. Different finches, different species of finches have different songs. And so because of that behavior, they're not going to come in contact with each other, support each other, and they're not going to mate. So all of these have to do with mating. They're not even going to mate. So that is not going to get to that point. They're not going to breed together because of those things that don't prevent mating. After that, we have a couple of things that technically they can try to mate. They might court each other and try, but mechanical isolation means mechanically it's not possible. There's no physical way for that mating to happen, whether it's the shape of a reproductive organ or something along those lines. And then sometimes their gametes just won't allow that fertilization to happen. Probably a good example of this would be the chromosome number. If the chromosome number is not going to match up, then it's not going to sperm is not going to fertilize it. Then we actually get to a point where, okay, mating was possible. They actually fertilized. The egg fertilized, or the sperm fertilized the egg. Okay. Now we're getting into what happens now that's preventing healthy, fertile, viable offspring. Sometimes that is the hybrids are not very viable. They're not healthy. Sometimes they produce healthy offspring, but the healthy offspring are not fertile. Think of mules. Mules are not fertile. And sometimes they just simply break down. They don't ever reproduce. They don't make more of themselves, and it's just, it ends there. The thing about the biological species concept is that it's limited in its use. Okay? It's only good for some things. For example, we can't evaluate reproductive isolation of fossils. So it's going to be really hard to look at two fossils and decide, are these existing species or not? Did they mate together? Did they produce healthy fertile offspring? That is sometimes a hard thing to answer when you're looking at a fossil. It also doesn't apply to asexual reproducers, because if you look at a lot of those reproductive isolated barriers, they have to be mating. And asexual reproducers just make more of themselves. There are exceptions like growler bears. Dogs and wolves can mate together. Let me show you a growler bear, if you don't know what one of those is. You got a grizzly bear and a polar bear. They can still mate. They can produce a hybrid called a growler bear. Okay, so there are exceptions to this. This biological species concept is certainly not perfect. There's always an exception to the rule, right? So what are some other definitions of species that are out there? Well, some scientists will use a morphological concept. That's where the species are characterized based on body shape and other structural features. Before we knew more molecular species, this is a lot of times what was happening and what we would do. The good for this is that it can be applied to sexual and asexual, and it can also be useful if you don't have any genetic information. Say you're looking at a fossil or something like that. The bad part of this is it relies on fairly subjective criteria. Even if we were all to look at the same elephant, we would not necessarily describe it in the same way. Ecological species concept is another one some scientists use, and it's always about the ecological niche. It can be applied to sexual and asexual, so that works. It emphasizes the role of disruptive natural selection. Disruptive natural selection, I think this is the as organisms adapt to different environmental conditions. But again, it's still not going to take into consideration their ability to reproduce together. It's not going to take into consideration their appearance. It's not going to take into consideration some other things that may be stronger pieces of evidence. The phylogenetic species concept defines a species as the smallest group of individuals that share a common ancestor. They share a common ancestor forming one branch of the tree of life. The bad one for this is it's difficult to determine the degree of difference required to indicate separate So this is where we're like, well, how much is so much in the difference that we would actually consider them separate? There are more than 20 other definitions that have been proposed, all with their usefulness depending on the situation. So honestly, when we look at categorizing things into different species through taxonomy, if you don't remember much about taxonomy, taxonomy is where everything has a domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then a species. Dumb kings play chess on fine green silk or whatever acronym you learn. And everything goes down to the species. So like Homo sapien is right here. And then Homo sapiens are grouped with other organisms and a genus and a family organism and all the way up until we are part of the animal kingdom in the domain Eukarya. So they all have different, so usually what happens is when an organism is placed into these categories, it is done based on an accumulation or a compromise of all of those different definitions. So let's talk now about speciation. Now that we've defined what a species is, they can breed together, they produce healthy or fertile offspring in the terms of a biologist. So allopatric speciation is when the gene flow is interrupted when a population is divided into geographically isolated subpopulations. So this means that this is speciation that occurs because they are divided by physical barriers. The separate gene pools diverge, and then different mutations will arise, and natural selection will act on each population, and then eventually reproductive isolation will arise. So let me go to this picture really quickly. This is allopatric speciation. These two groups are separated by a physical barrier. They can't get to each other. So within these populations, they are going to undergo natural selection. Why? Because they're going to mutate. Mutations are going to occur in the population. Somebody's going to be better than somebody else, and they're going to survive, and they're going to reproduce, and they're going to pass that down to their offspring. Okay? Now, eventually, if you took this fish, and you took this fish, and you took them out, and you put them in their own little pond together, this is my idea of a fish I do not draw. And you put them in a pond together, they're not going to have anything to do with each other. They're not going to physically mate. Okay? Or they might mate, and their offspring are not viable. Okay? So that's an example of allopatric speciation. Let me go back. Sympatric speciation is one that occurs where they still undergo some kind of reproductive isolation, but they're in the same geographical area. It can occur if gene flow is reduced due to polyploidy, that means extra sets of chromosomes, or the habitat is somehow differentiated, or there's some sexual selection going on. Polyploidy means species have originated from an accident during cell division, which results in extra sets of chromosomes, more common in plants, but it's still fairly rare. New species can arise because an accident happens, they have extra chromosomes, and then they continue to breed asexually and produce more that were the same chromosomes that is them. Habitat differentiation occurs when a group uses a habitat or a resource not used by the other parent population. So maybe they're using a tree differently, or they're mating at different times, or something like that. So here's the example of sympatric speciation. They're still together, but somehow they're still forming two separate species. Maybe they're utilizing a resource differently. Maybe they're one sleeping at night and one sleeping during the day, so they're not coming in contact with each other, but they physically are together. Here's an example of squirrels. They look very similar, but these two squirrels are actually different species because they live on opposite sides of the Grand Canyon, and they can't get to each other. If you put them in a room together, they are not going to be together. This is an example of the polyploidy where you can get lots of different combinations. You can get new plants a lot of times out of this because an accident happens. The gametes did not reduce, and then they formed with another gamete, and now all of a sudden you have extra chromosomes, and they reproduce and keep that trend going. It's very rare in animals. I don't think it would happen to animals, but it's very rare in plants. What are hybrid zones? They are regions or areas where members of species reproducing some offspring of mixed ancestry. It's used to reveal factors of reproductive isolation. It's used to figure out what is the reproductive isolation factor there, what is going to come or what is already beginning. So here is an example. We've got the yellow-bellied toad over here and the fire-bellied toad here. So right in between there in Europe, there's a hybrid zone where they will still mate. And so scientists can study them to try to figure out what is it separating these groups. What's the reproductive isolation that's pulling tours in the process of happening. So let's talk a little bit about the rate of speciation. How fast does it happen? It can occur quickly or it can occur more gradually. Punctuated equilibria is where you have periods of apparent stasis or non-movement or basically stable, and then periods of really sudden change. So here's your punctuated equilibrium. These two change very drastically over a shorter period of time, and then they're pretty much the same for a really long time, and then they undergo with some kind of change, and now they're separate species. This is where you have more gradual changes that ultimately result in two different species originating from this ancestral species. The cumulative effect of speciation and extinction events have helped shape the evolutionary changes documented in the fossil record. This is kind of the key concept here. This is what we're getting at, is that speciation in the period of extinction, periods of dramatic change, like natural disasters, like volcanoes and earthquakes and tsunamis and things that have really pushed or driven evolution. Those are things that make up our fossil record that is so crazy, and there's so much in it and so many differences in it. And that's it for today.